In this lesson, we're going to learn ionic compounds. Ionic compounds are basically compounds that contain ions. Ions are charged form of atoms. Substances that contain ions are usually characterized by some properties, like very high melting points and conducting electricity under certain conditions. They are usually formed between metals and nonmetals. That is, whenever you see elements from metal groups and elements from the nonmetal groups joined together, you can say that some ionic compounds are being formed. The most common example of an ionic compound would be the table salt, sodium chloride. We have sodium, that's from the metal groups, and chloride element, which is from the nonmetal groups. Together, they're forming an ionic compound. When it comes to the chemical formula of ionic compounds, we have some rules. But before that, there's one fact that's very important to remember, and that's all chemical compounds have a net charge of 0, and ionic compounds, just like any other compound, must have a net charge of 0. To understand the rules, you should understand the types of ions. If you need to make a review of that, I'll set the link above. Ions are made up of two types, the cations and the anions. Cations are positively charged. Anions are negatively charged. The first rule for an ionic compound is that both of these types of ions must be present to form an ionic compound. That means an ionic compound cannot contain only anions or only cations, because the net charge of a compound must be 0, and we need both of these types to make this balance. That also accounts for the other rule of ionic compounds, in which the number of cations and anions must be such that the net charge would be equal to 0. For example, the formula for sodium chloride is written as NaCl. That indicates each type of ion. Sodium, which is a positively charged ion, is combining with chloride, which is a negatively charged ion. Each sodium ion has a positive 1 charge, and each chloride ion has a negative 1 charge. So they must occur in equal numbers to give a net charge of 0. But what if the charge of the ions are not the same? Here comes the calculation and the balancing. Let's give an example. Let's say we have magnesium and chloride, and they're trying to form an ionic compound. The combination of these ions must be a net charge of 0, but magnesium has a charge of positive 2 and chloride has a charge of negative 1. So how are we going to let them form an ionic compound and make them balance? To be able to balance the two cation charges on magnesium, we'll need 2 chloride ions to give a net charge of 0. And the formula is going to look like this: 1 magnesium ion and 2 chloride ions. And remember that these subscripts are used to give the relative number of ions. Now let's consider an ionic compound that contains the ions barium and oxygen. How would be the correct formula? These ions have charges of the same number, but the opposite sign, so one of them is cation and one of them is anion. Barium has a positive 2 charge and oxygen has a negative 2 charge, so we don't need any balancing here. And the formula of the compound is going to look like this, without any subscripts.